Hi everyone, I'm Jacinthe Galpin and I am the creator, author, host and producer of the Risk-Tree podcast. I am so glad to be here with you again at Risk Awareness Week. Today I am going to bring you the top 10 badasses of risk. The top 10 figures from the past and present who I think are total badasses when it comes to risk. I'm also going to talk about why these figures matter in 2020. We all know 2020 has been a year of incredible disruption, change, the unknown. For me, these 10 badasses are the best sages we could possibly hope for when it comes to navigating not only how to just get through 2020, but also how to make 2020 a year where we don't wish for it to end. Coming in at number 10 is Amazon founder Jeff Bezos. And I know Bezos is a controversial figure for some of his business practices. But folks, when it comes to the unknown, Bezos is a disruptor and innovator for the ages. And that's why he makes the top 10 of risk badasses. Raised by a teenage single parent and with first-hand knowledge of what poverty felt like, Bezos, from the time he was a kid rigging up inventions in his mum's garage, to graduating from Princeton University, to working in hedge funding in New York City, to giving it all up to plow money into an online bookstore, writing his business plan while traveling from New York City to Seattle in a beat-up old car. Bezos has always viewed the unknown through the lens of opportunity. And his weapon or weapons of choice when entreating with the unknown? Bezos is the master of forging his own path. This is a man who sees the well-worn path of others and has decided, nah, I'm good, I'm just going to head this way. We tell our children to be true to themselves, but often we really hope they just turn out normal. Bezos is the man who took being true to himself to heart. Bezos is a master of carving out a competitive advantage that is unique to him, which makes it difficult, if not impossible, for others to catch up to him and erode his advantage. Think about Amazon. It really has no natural competitor as an entity, as a whole. It truly is the apex predator of the retail world, and that's because of Bezos. Bezos is a master of never becoming complacent. And we've seen this with so many legendary figures of history, a couple of whom are actually included in this list, that complacency opens the door to threat. Bezos has never given in to hubris and complacency, continuing to disrupt and innovate and grow his empire. Jeff Bezos has always understood the dual nature of risk, opportunity and threat, and relentlessly chases the former, while always being cognizant and hyper-aware of the dangers presented by the latter. His is an approach we should all adopt, seizing the good, fending off the bad, being a total risk badass in the process. At number 9, the Virgin Queen Elizabeth I of England. Elizabeth was a reformer, someone who recognised dysfunction and instability, and someone who actively worked to achieve peace. But, unlike so many other reformers who choose to brute force change via dictatorial means, Elizabeth was a play-it-as-it-lays reformer. And I think a lot of this had to do with her childhood and early adult years. She saw her father, the legendary for all the wrong reasons, Henry VIII, live a spectacle of a life. One minute she was beloved, doted on, and cared for by her father. Then, having executed her mother, Anne Boleyn, Henry discarded Elizabeth as an effective bastard. Elizabeth watched her father churn through wife after wife, beheading at least one more before he eventually died. Then, with her father's death, Elizabeth watched her sister, Mary, violently ascend the throne. Mary's reign was bloody and disruptive, with Mary taking revenge against the Protestants who she felt had betrayed both God and crown. Elizabeth herself became a victim of Mary when she was accused of treason and imprisoned in the Tower of London. Elizabeth became a moderate reformer. She avoided religious persecution. She was cautious in foreign affairs, and she engaged in no volatile treaties or alliances. In many arenas of the public space where monarchs traditionally had ruled with an iron fist, Elizabeth was positively apathetic. What resulted was a Renaissance-esque era in English society, the Elizabethan era, which allowed for foreign exploration, the opening of trade routes, and a flourishing of the arts, the likes of which allowed William Shakespeare to emerge. Elizabeth I is a risk badass because she understood threat at a primal level, which some might argue happens when your mum is executed by your dad for spurious reasons. Elizabeth's understanding of context and environment, it's the stuff of ISO 31000 case studies. Because she understood threat at a primal level, Elizabeth was a master of the effective control strategy/mitigation treatment. She was nuanced in her approach, almost surgical, in defining what needed to happen in order to either neutralize the threat or seize the opportunity. Finally, Elizabeth understood the need for space, and this is something very unique to her. As opposed to seeking to control every element of the unknown, Elizabeth was content, even welcoming, of allowing space for evolution. Coming in at number 8, the Italian mountaineer Reinhold Messner. Messner is a badass in life generally. This is a man who climbed his first mountain when he was 5 years old. A man who made the first solo ascent of Mount Everest without supplemental oxygen. The first human to ever ascend all 14 peaks over 8,000 metres above sea level. The first human to cross both Antarctica and Greenland without the assistance of snowmobiles or dog sleds. When it comes to risk, Reinhold Messner is a breath of fresh air. He understands risk, not in the bureaucratized, corporatized way that has become so prevalent in our discipline. Reinhold Messner, like Elizabeth I, understands risk at a primal level, and he understands the yield or return that comes from entreating with the unknown, both the good and the bad. And when I say the bad, I mean the bad. Messner lost his brother Gunther in 1970 when both were scaling Nanga Parbat, the 9th tallest mountain in the world in Nepal. Gunther, delirious after ascending the summit, was killed on their decline by an ice avalanche. It would not be until 2005, 35 years after his death, that Gunther's remains were found and returned to the family. So Messner knows the true dark side of risk, and he still entreats. And he entreats because he knows the recipe for risk success. For Messner, failure is natural, and you shouldn't avoid the unknown because you fear failure. From the man himself, without failures, I would not be here. I learned most of what I know today through them. For Messner, failure is not a bad thing, so long as you learn from it. Indeed, failure can be the greatest instructor of all. Success, true success, comes from courage. Messner has no interest in the easy win. It doesn't interest him. And in his mind, you shouldn't pat yourself on the back for what we in Australia would call a gimme. Instead, success comes from being courageous in your decision-making, maintaining integrity when others do not, and always doing the right thing even when no one is watching. Identify and commit to your objective. Messner will openly say he's not the best mountaineer. He will declare that his climbing partners have never been the best either. But Because he and his teams identify and commit to their objective, they minimize threat, because everything they do is with that shared end in mind. They all move in lockstep, emboldened by a clear understanding of what needs to happen and how they are going to do it. It should be of surprise to precisely no one that Dolly Parton is on this list. When it comes to Dolly, there is perhaps no one, besides Dolly herself, who knows more about this extraordinary woman's life than me. Born in a one-room log cabin in the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee, the fourth of 12 children to sharecroppers, Dolly grew up knowing what it was like to be poor. Her song, The Coat of Many Colours, documents how her mother Avie made her a coat out of scraps of material donated to the family, because the winter was coming and the family didn't have the money to buy coats. Dolly was raised by a family that instilled in her a belief that opportunity wasn't something you waited for. It was something you yourself curated, incubated, and unleashed. If you didn't have what you needed to get it done, go out and make it happen. The Partons were also fearless underdogs, and that makes sense. When you are that poor, you don't have much to lose, so you might as well go all out. Instilled with this exquisite understanding of opportunity and the need to never not chase, Dolly's career has been one of pivoting on action. She started her career as a songwriter when no one would give her a record label. Then, when she was recognised, record producers wanted her to be a bubblegum pop singer. She persisted until they recognised her talents when it came to country. Over a period of 5 decades, Dolly Parton has been a songwriter, singer, actor, and in a move everyone told her would be an unmitigated disaster, successful theme park owner, operating Dollywood and Dollywood Splash Country out of her beloved Smoky Mountains. Her advisors told her she'd be bankrupt in a year if she moved into theme parks. Today, the Dollywood theme parks are the #1 ticketed tourist attractions in Tennessee. Dolly Parton is a national treasure. She is also a risk gem. Dolly Parton is the epitome of the risk underdog, that person or group who hunts opportunity with an innate hunger, and without the fear and trepidation that haunts the sure bet. Dolly Parton pivots on action, not words. I often fear that our discipline gets caught up in bureaucracy at the expense of action, and that we lose our value proposition in the process. Dolly Parton's life tells us, and I'll use a phrase that is common here in the South, get her done. Pensiveness and her handmaidens have no place in a risk world. Finally, the impossible isn't. All you need is a plan to mitigate the threat, maximize the opportunity, and you may just have a winner on your hands. Coming in at number 6, the inventor and disruptor Nikola Tesla, the magnificent Serbian-born visionary, whose incredible innovations have helped to define how we live, work, play and exist in 2020. Like many great disruptors, it was in childhood that Tesla's natural curiosity for the world around him was channeled into disruptive technologies. Tesla would talk about how his mother, Juka, herself a housewife, would spend hours developing life hacks to make her job in the home easier. Rather than follow his father into the Eastern Orthodoxy, Tesla developed a passion, some would call it an obsession, with electricity and how it could be used. He emigrated to the United States and began working for none other than Thomas Edison. He and Edison came into conflict, hardly a surprise, and Tesla branched out on his own. And it's at this point that Tesla went into disruptive overdrive. The Tesla coil, a transformer able to produce high voltage, low current, high frequency alternating current electricity. The magnifying transmitter, which allowed for electricity to be distributed wirelessly for distances up to 1 kilometre. The Tesla turbine, a highly efficient turbine engine that used combustion to make the discs rotate. Neon signs. Tesla did not invent fluorescent or neon lights, but he did transform the technology into the signs we now see today around the world. And he invented the world's first radio-controlled boat. Tesla is a disruptor, which automatically makes him a risk legend in my opinion. But he is perhaps more nuanced than other disruptors, most notably his former employer and some would say natural nemesis, Thomas Edison. Tesla was ahead of his time. Often Tesla innovated and disrupted because in his mind, the world was a puzzle that needed solving. He didn't always work with a pragmatic outcome in mind, and that takes a level of bravery not many have, but it's something Tesla had in spades. Tesla was a great communicator, and this might sound like an odd characteristic of a master, but Tesla was brilliant at taking nebulous, complex, ethereal concepts and translating those concepts into digestible layperson chunks of information that influenced decision-making in his favour. You know, what we try to do every single day as risk practitioners. Tesla was a master of persuasion and a brilliant, influential communicator. Tesla was methodical. If you look at Tesla's working papers and sketches, there is a beautiful logic to his work and a depth of thought that revealed his intimate understanding of what he was doing. His methodical approach is one we can all benefit from. We are halfway through the top 10 badasses of risk, and coming in at number 5 is Alexander the Great Macedonian military leader, empire builder, and ruthless opportunist. Alexander the Great ascended the Macedonian throne at the age of 20 and died just 10 years later. But in that time, he created the greatest and largest empire in human history, an empire that stretched from Greece in the west to my ancestral homeland of India in the east. What is interesting about Alexander the Great is that his armies weren't the biggest, the strongest, the most mighty. And they didn't need to be. Alexander the Great, tutored by the philosopher Aristotle, had been educated in the ways of the unknown. What Alexander might have lacked in his armies, he more than made up for with his understanding and exploiting of terrain, his military tactics, many of which were unique to him and which caught his enemies unaware, a strategy Napoleon Bonaparte would later use, and his troops' morale and loyalty. Alexander the Great understood and deployed lines of defense/threat dilution. And I know lines of defense is controversial in 2020. It shouldn't be. Threat dilution, which is what lines of defense is a method humans have deployed since the beginning of time to minimize the impact of threat. And few did it better than Alexander the Great. He never relied on a single method or strategy. He always had lines of defense so that if one fell over, he could still respond. Alexander was incredibly adaptive to the unknown. For example, during his India campaign, his armies had never fought an enemy that used elephants. Initially, they didn't know how best to entreat, but they adapted. They opened their ranks and created a circle around the elephants. The Macedonians then used their spears to dislodge the handlers and defeat their enemy. Alexander understood that compromise does not equal failure. Sometimes compromise is a win. Alexander's empire was vast, and there was no way he could maintain strict control over its operations. In response, Alexander would make deals with the leaders of the countries and territories he conquered, allowing them to retain religious freedom, economic freedom, offering them Macedonian citizenship, some dominion over their day-to-day. In the process of compromising, Alexander was able to secure and preserve his empire. He was content to give a little in order to gain a lot. At number 4, Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was born into the world of Jim Crow. So for those unaware, after the emancipation of African American slaves, Confederate states in the southern US, with Democrat Party-controlled legislators, enacted Jim Crow laws which sought to disenfranchise African Americans. Growing up, Rosa's was a world of daily humiliation. She recalled how in elementary school, white kids had a bus to take them. African American kids had to walk. From the woman herself, "I'd see the bus pass every day, but to me, that was a way of life. We had no choice but to accept what was the custom." It was December 1, 1955, when a wary 42-year-old Rosa Parks boarded a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. The way segregated buses worked was that white passengers were able to sit up the front. A sign would separate white from African American. The sign could be moved by the bus driver at whim to ensure that white passengers always had a seat. If there were no more seats for African American passengers, they had to get off the bus and wait for the next one. That night, the bus was full. The driver moved the sign back to accommodate the white passengers. Rosa needed to give up her seat. She refused. As she later said, "I thought of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old African American who was lynched in Mississippi after being accused of offending a white woman in her family's grocery store, whose killers were tried and acquitted. And I just couldn't go back." Rosa was arrested. Her arrest triggered off a national crisis on race relations in the US. Rosa Parks is a risk badass because she took on existential threat and won. Have no doubt, the life of an African American in the Jim Crow South, one wrong move, one out-of-place word, it could get you killed. And there was still enough hatred in the South that even if you didn't find yourself dead, you'd get no justice anyway. Rosa Parks shows us what it means to be brave in the face of incredible threat. Rosa Parks knew how to maximize opportunity when she saw it. Rosa had worked in civil rights for over 20 years by the time December 1 came along. In that time, she had learned how to spot an opportunity and how to maximize the yield coming from that opportunity. A serendipitous risk sixth sense, I'd like to think. Finally, Rosa Parks is a risk badass because she used her opportunity to change the world. Rosa Parks. You say the name and everyone knows what you are talking about, and everyone can tell you the story, and everyone can tell you the legacy forged. It all began with Rosa taking a risk. Time for number 3, and I have no doubt that this figure will surprise a lot of you. Not necessarily his presence because you know he'd be in the mix somewhere, but you might be surprised at his position. Napoleon Bonaparte. I know, right? He's not number 1. Look, Napoleon Bonaparte will always be my favourite historical figure. But when it comes to risk badasses, there are 2 individuals badder than him. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Napoleon Bonaparte was a man who clawed his way to the top of the European pile through an intoxicating mix of guile, cunning, opportunism, and agility. Napoleon first made his move during the French Revolution, aligning himself with the Jacobins, who were, in the mid to late 1790s, the holders of power in a France still fractured by revolution. Evidence suggests that Napoleon wasn't 100% all in with the Jacobins, but he was prepared to hold his nose and play nicely, so long as he got what he wanted. Having obtained the trust of the Jacobins, Napoleon was put in charge of France's armies, and he didn't waste the opportunity. Fighting against mightier and stronger opponents, all of whom wanted France's royals reinstated, Napoleon opted for guerrilla warfare and was highly successful. His opponents were stunned by his aggression, confused by his tactics, fearful of his presence. But, as we all know from history, Napoleon lost the plot pretty quickly. He became complacent, overcome by hubris. He began to believe that he was a control/treatment strategy in and of himself, rather than remembering that it was his ability to understand the unknown that made him so great to begin with. So his end was ignominious. But he is still number 3 on my list of risk badasses, because at his peak, Napoleon was the master of risk-based strategy. Look at Napoleon's early battle plans. They were all about threat and opportunity, and they mapped in great detail how the army would respond when faced with a set of variables. Napoleon knew that leadership matters. The French army was incredibly demoralized when Napoleon was put in charge. Napoleon changed all of that. He took his time to educate and train his men on risk-based strategy. He led from the front, always. He never asked his soldiers to do something he himself would not. And Napoleon challenged traditional doctrine. Look at his Egyptian campaign, the early one. Everyone predicted he would fail because European armies traditionally never did well in Africa. Napoleon proved everyone wrong. Sometimes we are going to encounter situations that seem unwinnable. We are going to encounter a circumstance or problem or challenge that on the face of it ends with us losing. Napoleon shows us that challenging traditional doctrine establishes an alternative competitive space that exists on our terms. What can I say? I love the man. That's why he's at number 3. Coming in at number 2, Hannibal Barker, the great Carthaginian general and the ultimate strategist. For those of you who listen to my podcast, you will be familiar with my love for Hannibal Barker, a man whose legacy resonates today, over 2,000 years since his death. Military strategists still, to this day, use his battle plans in modern warfare. Such is the timelessness of what Hannibal was able to achieve. In an ancient world where brute strength often reigned supreme, Hannibal Barker opted for strategy over strength, intelligence over might, agility over brawn. From the great military historian Theodore Dodge, Hannibal excelled as a tactician. No battle in history is a finer sample of tactics than the Battle of Cannae. But he was yet greater in logistics and strategy. No captain ever marched to and fro among so many armies of troops superior to his own numbers, as fearlessly and skillfully as he. No man ever held his own so long or so ably against such odds. Constantly overmatched by better soldiers, led by generals always respectable, often of great ability, he yet defied all their efforts for half a generation. Hannibal defied the odds because when facing the unknown, strategy matters, and Hannibal knew that. In the seminal Battle of Cannae between Carthage and Rome, he was outnumbered 3-1. On paper, it was to be a rout by the Romans, and yet Hannibal was able to devise and execute a strategy so simple that the battle was over within minutes. He took advantage of terrain, known Roman battle skews, known Roman battle hubris, and he ensured his own army understood their role and executed to perfection. There was no one more feared 2,000 years ago than Hannibal Barker. He was like the Terminator of his time. He could not be beaten, he could not be outmaneuvered, and he could not be outrisked. Hannibal Barker is a risk badass because he understood that a good strategy can mitigate weakness. And this is so important in our world because, and we've seen this in 2020 so many times, the strongest won't always prevail when it comes to disruption. Strategy is critical to navigate disruptive times such as we are seeing in 2020. And if you're looking for an expert strategist to emulate, Hannibal is your man. Hannibal, like so many on this list, exemplifies the power that comes via the freedom of the risk underdog. Because he was often the weaker protagonist, Hannibal was able to flex and innovate. He tried the new, the weird, the unproven, because he could. He had nothing to lose. Finally, Hannibal Barker changed how people of the ancient world saw risk. And I know this is a pretty big claim, but stay with me here. If you look at the trajectory of risk over time, Hannibal's era was one of threat mitigation, primarily. Life was tough. Life was hard. You just got through it. Hannibal, being Hannibal, shifted the perception of risk from something that was all bad to a more fulsome embrace of opportunity. And I'm not saying that opportunity chasing wasn't present before, but Hannibal industrialized it, for want of a better phrase, and wove it into the fabric of human evolution. Plus, anyone who could scare the Romans, they're cool with me. Coming in at number 1 is abolitionist and activist Harriet Tubman, the queen of the Underground Railroad, and my number 1 risk badass of all time. Harriet Tubman was born into slavery in Maryland. She was brutalized as a child, beaten almost daily. When she was an adolescent, she was asked by a slave overseer to help restrain another slave who was trying to escape. When she refused, the overseer flung a weight at her head, resulting in her suffering lifelong seizures and narcoleptic episodes. In 1849, Tubman escaped from slavery. But for Tubman, her escape was not enough. She wanted to bring others with her. So, she went back to the South, back into the danger zone, leading multiple missions to guide slaves to the free North, with the help of the Underground Railroad. Tubman was courageous and unrelenting. She always carried a weapon with her, to use against slave catchers she knew were hunting her, or to shoot an African American who, having started the journey to the north, wanted to turn around. She once told a tale of one young man who, fearful of the journey, wanted to turn back into slavery. She brought out her gun, held it to his head, and said, "You go on, or die." Suffice to say, he went on and made it to freedom. Tubman was clever and agile. She started all missions on a Saturday because Sunday was a day of rest, and masters would not know their slaves would be missing until Monday, giving her a 2-day head start. She preferred undertaking missions in the winter because the nights were longer and darkness offered cover. When faced with threat, she thought on her feet. Having come face to face with a former owner, she grabbed a couple of chickens and pretended to lose control of the chickens, hoping that the noise and kerfuffle would distract the man. And it did. She never lost a slave. She never got caught. Thank God for Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman is a risk master for the ages. She understood context and used that understanding to guide her controls and treatment strategies. And this might sound like, oh well, everyone should know that. But Harriet Tubman was a true master of this capability, because if she got it wrong, people died. The stakes were high in Harriet's game. She knew that, and she never got it wrong. Harriet acted with integrity and strength. This is important in our discipline, perhaps underrated. Harriet used her moral compass to guide her actions. As a result, she might have been agile and capable of shifting her action, but she never once lost sight of her principles, nor did she ever engage in any act that compromised those principles. Harriet Tubman beat the bad guys, and I know that's somewhat of a trite reason to think of her as a risk master. But we all know risk can be an agnostic discipline. The good guys use it, as do the bad guys. When the good guys use our discipline to win, that makes me happy. I always think of Harriet Tubman as this ray of light. Her opponents, bumbling fools who deserved the hoodwinking they got. And that's exactly how it should be. So let's summarise this collection of risk masters. At number 10, Jeff Bezos, the apex disruptor. Number 9, Queen Elizabeth I, the reformer. Number 8, Reinhold Messner, the fearless. Number 7, Dolly Parton, the underdog. Number 6, Nikola Tesla, the visionary. Number 5, Alexander the Great, the empire builder. Number 4, Rosa Parks, the revolutionary. Number 3, Napoleon Bonaparte, the clever. Number 2, Hannibal Barker, the strategist. And number 1, Harriet Tubman, the courageous. As you look at that roster of magical risk badasses, aren't these all the characteristics we ought to embody as expert risk practitioners? I can't help but think that if we got this crew together in a room, the world could solve a whole lot of problems. I'm curious, if you were to pull together your list of top 10 risk masters, who would they be and why? And of all the 10 here today, which one do you identify the most with as a risk practitioner? Are you the courageous, the fearless, the revolutionary, or a mix of a few? I'd love to get your thoughts. On that note, thank you so much for tuning in today. If you enjoyed today, please tune in to the Risktree podcast, www.risktreepodcast.com.